action is in fact nonviolent. Yet societies can often be violent in their inherent systems and structures. Systems and structures that reflect an environment of violence, a pervasive and perpetual condition that limits the opportunities of one class or group of people, preventing the disfavored from the opportunities for achieving their full potential. Such conditions isolate groups and classes of people from the mainstream, politically, socially, and economically. And they too often breed other forms of violence that disrupt the tranquil lifestyles of the favored. Both forms of violence destroy community. Community was at the very heart of what my father believed in. He used to speak about something he called the beloved community, which was his vision for the future, that nonviolence is helping us to reach a dream of a place and a time where society is at peace with itself, and citizens from all backgrounds are treated as equal human beings. In his vision, it is a place where everyone has the opportunity to achieve their full potential. In the beloved community, all forms of violence, discrimination, prejudice, poverty, war are replaced by peace, justice, equality, and community. In the beloved community, disputes are resolved by peaceful negotiation between adversaries. In the beloved community, love and trust triumph over hatred and fear. Peace prevails over violence, and the midnight of desperation succumbs to the daybreak of joy. It is a vision that knows no boundaries of race, religion, or place. It's not an impossible utopian dream, but a state of heart and mind, a spirit of hope and goodwill that transcends all boundaries and builds a world where our children can achieve prosperity and peace. It is not a place reserved for only one people, but for all peoples. The beloved community is what is often referred to as the dream that Martin Luther King Jr. shared in 1963, August 28th. As he said during that speech in Washington, D.C., but his dream was about so much more than achieving any short-term political goal or expanding rights solely for one ethnic group. That dream was that even in the direst circumstances, we are capable of overcoming our differences, our hateful conflicts, and replacing them with understanding, peace, and even love. As we all know, though, the more difficult issue is, how do we get there? He believed that the answer to that question was very simple, and it was through nonviolence. Like most people, maybe he even had doubts at first and thought nonviolence may be a nice idea. But can it really work against brute force or structural injustice? Well, like Gandhi before him and so many others after him, he proved that it could. He proved that it is possible to overcome difficulties and achieve harmony through active, peaceful means. During the time when my father and his team were working in the 50s and 60s, African Americans were still considered second-class citizens in the United States. Few were allowed to vote. Most were barred from the economic and educational opportunities enjoyed by whites. And the threat of harassment, physical abuse, and even death was always present. In the southern United States, especially, things were not very different than the days of slavery in some of those communities. But there were men and women devoted to seeing that that system changed. People willing to stand up for what they believed in, no matter the cost, so that all Americans could be considered as equal. Today, there are some who think that the American civil rights movement was inevitably nonviolent in nature, but that's not the case. There were some in the African American community who believed that the only language that white Americans would understand was the language of bullets. There were some who called for separatism, violence, and even today what we may call terrorism, acts of destruction and retribution against personal property and innocent civilians. And there were those who branded people like my father, or at least referred to him in denigrating terms, like the term Uncle Tom, which is certainly a very negative term for African Americans. But he and his team stood strong to their principles, even when they were beaten or their houses were bombed. In fact, our home was bombed in 1955. I was not born, but my older sister, who now is deceased, was. And fortunately, my mother and my sister were not harmed. And my father's brother's home was bombed. But even in spite of those kind of things, they knew that violence could never achieve their goal of freedom and equal rights, nor could it result in true peace. They knew that only by working nonviolent could they lead people to reconsider their beliefs and begin moving toward a future of coexistence, a future of community. The reason realizing the dream and the King Center that I represent is here today is because we believe that both Israel and the Palestinian territories hold an enormous potential for showing the world where the next great nonviolence case will be. I visited this land many times over the past few years, and through the people I've met, I have witnessed this powerful potential firsthand. It's represented in this room this evening by each of you dedicated activists, thinkers, leaders, and citizens of all who are dedicated to this cause of nonviolence. It's also represented by those at the top of society, such as Shimon Peres, who've shown us that nonviolence is not about marches or protests. It's also about diplomacy and negotiations. It's about education and dialogue. It's about hoping that a better day is possible and then doing all that is necessary for us to reach that day. I am confident that even though times may be difficult and the situations may seem intractable, that men and women of goodwill will find the courage and the strength to reach a better day. I strongly believe that my father was right when he said that human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle. The tireless exertions and passionate concerns of dedicated individuals. And so this evening, as I prepare to close, I always utilize additional words of my father's, for he often told us that we should be headlights and not taillights, because headlights lead. And leadership is a critical component to bring about change, to bring about justice, to bring about equality, to bring about the total essence of what the human spirit represents. Because I believe that we as human beings are God's highest creation. And although we sometimes don't act that way, that somehow we can and must do better. For we are better specimens oftentimes in the behavior that we exhibit.